Hello, guys. Again, thank you for coming to not only this keynote, but also to this conference in general. I would like to use this opportunity to, we're going to touch base today on, again, where is she? She broke down beautifully what we're about to talk to. We're going to go into, again, taxonomy, and specifically today how the Liasis genus fits into the Australasian aspects of herpetology in regards to a recently published paper, which I will again, touch base on in a second. What I would like to do is actually, with some of these endeavors that I get invited to do, I like to, again, create a storyline or a narrative, if you will, something that you guys can follow or something that I believe has resonance with you. And so today, again, as a writer, as someone who works with journals and various publications, creativity is a cornerstone for me in how I develop my work, how I look at my research, and how I think it's essential for progression. So what I would like to begin with today is this is my viewpoint and how I think creativity finds itself in the conservation realm and how it can better biodiversity in itself and how we need to always keep this at the forefront. So I'm going to begin with the most of it. I'm actually going to end with the lagging paragraph. And with that being said, I will begin. As a whole, we're a creative type. We live in between the harsh realities of our present surroundings and the idyllic fruitions we work to one day become tangible. We're conservationists. We're an optimistic whole. We don't just occupy one geometric niche, we think outside the box. Chase Jarvis, a freelance photographer, once said in conversation with Dr. Brene Brown, a professor at the University of Houston and vulnerability researcher, that creativity is the new literacy. The thoughts, the ideas one contains and chooses to share with his or her own world is the empathetic capital we should all embrace, conventional or otherwise. Like pen to paper, creativity is the medium between action and reality. It's the infrastructure of all sound progression. But that's not to say creativity is the sole variable responsible for all well-thought-out action. It surely isn't. It can't be. If we were to all wait with bated breath for divine intervention to come and grace our thoughts with purpose, I wouldn't be typing this opening in an incandescent lit room hunched over my laptop's backlit screen. Self-actuation and the notion of presence are the rugged edges of which creativity hones from. After all, if we're trying to mold our shared biosphere into a more laudable, ecocentric shape, we must be both self-aware and cognizant to do so. We have to find commonality with our own kin. But even more importantly, we have to recognize our own gifts, the personality traits that define each and every one of us. And our vocational callings, our career endeavors, are the lenses of which we see ourselves and the audiences around us. As a writer, the familiar space between my chalked fingertips and the tactile feedback of a backlit keyboard is a transcendental medium. There, I have no borders, no unwelcome stimuli permeating the synaptic spaces of my thoughts, and I'm completely self-aware and cognizant of my being in the world. And that's not to say that writing, however, is an introverted act. It surely isn't. Without resonance, cultural or individual, your characters, your words, are just that, empty text on a page. Nothing more, nothing less. Just a desired word count. However, when a day's writing is going well, the evening sunset seems to apparate out of thin air, and the hours and hours of writing eclipsing any notion of the, quote, workday, all fade into the background. And I'm oftentimes left with 4,000 proud words. However, take special note of the former adjective, proud, because therein lies the fundamental principle of all well-executed journalism, because those words aren't usually rooted from mental and physical fatigue. Today, we occupy a society that puts the work meal mentality over any other mantra. I remember one casual dinner, a perpetually exhausted friend of mine shared with me this small self-validated nugget of wisdom. If you get only 5 hours of sleep a night, manage to clock in an 80-hour work week, then that means you're killing it and you're ahead of the curve. Had his eyes not been reminiscent of those of a raccoon and his complexion a bit less ghost white, then maybe his dialogue might have had some surface-level worth, but they couldn't even carry through the restaurant's climate-controlled atmosphere with great ease. He was burnt out by every definition of the word. Now, this is not to belittle work ethic, but more so to showcase intelligent planning. Operating from a place of chronic exhaustion often yields lackluster material, needing even more time to tweak and rework. I replied, I applaud you for your dedication, but I'm curious to know what's your on-point accuracy with these articles you've been writing. How well have they been received, and how well have they been received? I waited with bated breath. Well, I rewrote my last piece for a client 5 times because they said it wasn't original enough. And I'm sure that piece might have still very well been drafted in a word processor somewhere, yet graced by the suppression of the publication button. This anecdote, again, is not to belittle drive. If If anything, it's a calling card for the importance of well thought out work ethic, to create, to build with both urgency and self-awareness. And both the former and latter are neither dichotomous nor disconnected. They live in mutualism with one another. To create is to build something that's not yet been brought into this world, and in itself is an act of purity. But that's a perplexing thought when you factor in us, the conservationists, the planetary warriors we are, a population with the foresight to see our biosphere's needs. We aren't solely aiming at creation. We also have our crosshairs fixated on the idea of preservation and presence in the world. In a world where palm oil plantations sit in still haunting silence amongst the thick smog of industrialization, we dare not add kindling to the already ecological fire set before us by our fellow humans. We hope to, if anything, wet it by blocking its flames with our ideas steeped in retention. It's those lingering thoughts of a world not blanketed by soot, but rather carpeted by leaf litter, where we find solitude. And, as activists, it's our divine job to coax our fellow man into familiar mind spaces. I've always said that if a picture's worth 1,000 words and a metaphor is 1,000 mental images, then there's nothing more powerful, more cementing than a creative account on situational realism. Stepping into one's shoes, or in many of our cases, the niches of the flora and fauna we've devoted much of our lives to, is impossible without a sense of belonging. To be fully present in the lives of someone or something else, situational empathy and camaraderie must be both in the foreground simultaneously. We create on intellect, but we act on emotion. And without it, every attempt at progression will inevitably reach an emotional roadblock. And again, I'm going to lead with the last paragraph from that excerpt. So with that being said, we'll go straight into this. Again, so earlier I alluded to there was a paper recently published, and that paper was Toward the Tree of Life for the Boas and Pythons, a multiculculus species-level phylogeny with unprecedented taxon sampling. And essentially, this paper broke down both the Pythonidae and Boidae family from an 80% species pool, which was unprecedented beforehand. And this was, again, published in 2014. And what this did was it showed from a very broad perspective of how the snakes and the pythons and boas specifically, how we know them, how they intermingle, and how they've been able to evolve on similar chords of life. And exactly, and like I alluded to in the title, one of those taxas and genuses, their genres, was the Liasis genus. And it's, again, another endearing genus that I've had the pleasure of working with time and time again through captive examples and really have become enamored with. And again, is another taxa that's kind of veiled around a sense of enigma. So again, we're going to go straight into it from there. These are the olive pythons of Australia, and so these of Northern Australia, rather. So again, we have the Queensland and Northern olive pythons. It's their common names, and these guys are, again, one of the continent's largest pythons, attaining sizes between 3 and 4 meters in length. Again, sexual dimorphism present in most pythons and boas, where females will attain a greater length and girth. And again, these are endemically quite common throughout their ranges. There, however, is little solid population accounts. However, we do know through this observation and through personal accounts that they are quite common, and they are able to somehow intermingle with our infrastructure and do quite well. On kind of the antithetical to that, we have the Pilbara python, olive python. And these guys were just actually recently subspeciated in 1981. And aside from the fact that they attain a larger length and girth, with animals females reaching up towards 5 meters in length, just shy of 17 feet if you want to use any sort of standard notions, occupy a very insular habitat range. Again, they occupy the Pilbara region of Western Australia. And while, yes, they are actually denoted by the country as a endangered species and one worth more data analysis, worth more observation, they are, however, endemically common throughout that small insular habitat. And there's been talk through some herpetologists about whether or not they should be taken off because of their endemic commonality. However, I would side with not saying that, just because they occupy such a small region that any sort of teetering ecological imbalance could just domino affect any sort of population and could be quickly wiped off. And again, you don't see the latter species, the Pilbara, in captivity North American herpetology or Australian herpetology, you only will see the northern and Queensland olive python. From there, we're going to go into the Papuan pythons. And again, this is a species, the former pictures actually, when I took, it's kind of hard to see with this angle, of an animal I've been working with for probably the better part of 7 years now. And I used her for educational shows as well. And became just enamored with their ecology, their evolutionary quirks, the niche they fill within their environment as well. And so again, these animals occupy throughout the entire island of New Guinea, again, occupying the lowland and lowland marshlands. And again, they are probably the largest snake on the island, competing with the scrub pythons as well, of various localities. Again, females reaching upwards of 5 meters, roughly 17 feet. And what's interesting about them is, as I alluded to in the title slide, they were previously a monotypic genus, so they were previously the only species within the genus Apodora. But again, the study that has now really assimilated, and we looked into the genealogy of all these examples of pythons and boas, have then again been moved back into the Liasis genus, and they've been again kind of having that dance for the better part of 90 years since they were first recognized. And again, they have quite a bit of quirks. They're also ophiophagous, meaning I've worked with quite a bit. I've worked with a myriad of species throughout my career endeavors and interests and whatnot. And the animals that I've worked with, the Papuan pythons that I've worked with, have an insatiable desire to seek out other snakes from a predatory aspect. I've had animals during moving shifts and whatnot, try to actively hunt through the glass 15-foot African rock pythons. I've had animals consume with a tenacity other snakes as well, and that seems to be the crux, I guess, the cornerstone of their dietary things. And again, even in their endemic habitats, they've been known to prey on scrub pythons as well. This is the island's second largest species. And from the bottom, I'm going to talk about a well-noted observation, and it's the fact that we've seen Tracy Barker, who is a presence in the Herpetoculture Society, has noted that there seems to be a bit of phenotypic differences between animals of the eastern side of the island versus animals of the western side of the island. The eastern side of the island, we have animals that are attaining larger lengths, larger girths, but also have a facial profile quite different than that of the western animals. The western animals have a bit more of a bulldog face. It's a bit more snouted. It's a bit more narrow. However, animals of the eastern side seem to have this elongated, very, I would say, more python usual look to them. And again, there's been no hard science to really back this up. There's nothing to really to solidify that. But the worthwhile notion, from looking at it from a researcher perspective, the worthwhile notion is noting that these animals again favor habitats in low-lying marshlands. So if you look at the western side of Papua New Guinea, you can see from this topographic map that there's a plethora of lowland activity, favorable habitats. However, if you look to the eastern side of the island, we see insular pockets of suitable habitats. So essentially, there's the idea of populations being bottlenecked and then situationally evolving is a worthwhile, I think, dialogue and idea to kind of mull over. So just a worthwhile nod to that idea of a possible subspeciation within this species. And again, we're going to go kind of to the antithetical, not the antithetical really, but on a much more known species, it's going to be the water pythons. And what's interesting about water pythons is the fact that they represent one of the most endemically common, not only snake species on the continent, but predatory vertebrates in general within the Fog Dam Northern Territory. In that area, these animals actually represent the highest concentration of predatory vertebrates found nearly anywhere else in the world. So with that notion, if you were to drive a car down any stretch of that area, you would see just a plethora of animals either basking on the road or actively seeking out prey. These again are more so active hunters as opposed to the more lethargic ambush predators that we've seen in the past. And again, they seem to assimilate themselves within human infrastructure quite well. And what's happening is that we're seeing that again, this is another quite rare snake in both the captive and research sense. These are called the freckled pythons of insular Indonesia, specifically the Lesser Sudans Islands. And again, we see quite a bit of subspeciation, especially on the island of Cebu. Again, we had on the very end. The latter slide, we have the Savu python, and again, phenotypically, you have a bit of difference between them. Obviously, there's more of a yellow tint to the Macklot's python, which are commonly called on the top. Again, populating much of the Lesser Sudans Island archipelago, and then on the bottom we have the Savu python, which is more so in a concentrated island again in that same region. And there hasn't been any accounts yet of any sort of hybridization between these two. So again, they seem to be quite separated from one another. Another idea that just came to me, to be quite honest, the other night was when I was again mulling over this research that I had been collecting for the past, X time, that a common physical trait that all these animals share is iridescence. And iridescence is it's a beguiling character for lack of a better formal description, but it also serves a purpose from an evolutionary and survival standpoint. So what I would like to also I think it's another great thread to kind of talk about is really the rationale of why an animal needs iridescence, essentially. And there was a conference, I think 2 years ago, and they published a paper called the Iridescence. Let's see, somewhere. There we go. The iridescence of functional perspection, and here it was a fantastic. The paper looked at iridescence in the sense that whether there's thermal regulation, whether the variables of mating, sexual dimorphism, how male and female iridescence, while there may be bridges, how it can be used for courtship, and a few examples really struck out at me in the sense in how it relates to the Liasis genus specifically, and especially juvenile animals. Iridescence, as we all know, especially if any zoologists and biologists in here as well, is that vivid colors in nature usually often connote ideas of danger, of an off-putting stimuli. And so that's a worthwhile notion, again, for a small juvenile animal to have, especially one that's usually monochromatic, that doesn't exactly blend well with its surroundings. It's a worthwhile physicality to kind of adopt. And then another thing worth noting is that the idea of prey positioning. So again, how we have, a good analogy to use is Siberian tigers. We know they have bars, and we know that helps them that pattern breaks them up against the background, so they're able to essentially sneak up on their upcoming prey. Iridescence has been what we're seeing has somewhat of the same quirk, in the sense of very high visually acute animals like birds of prey, et cetera, et cetera. So this shimmering glint, this oil slick physicality, again, breaks up their pattern in lighting. And also a worthwhile notion is it's startling as well. So again, for example, we use a bird of prey seeking down we'll say a poplin python, juvenile poplin python, in a strong beam of light. That iridescence, which is quite strong in poplin pythons, which from what I've seen, could very well be a startling visual notion, visual cue, and giving the prey, the poplin python, time to again escape and elude the questioning predator. So again, I thought it was a worthwhile notion to kind of cover today. And again, with that, I'm going to close today. Another thing I advocate is really exposing people to your passions and your ideas of conservation who otherwise wouldn't be in that same realm. So again, I work for the Texas State Department of Wildlife, and I would bring my animals to work sometimes and just walk down the aisles in the cubicles and let people just kind of break down their glass ceiling walls, of snakes being slimy and, of unattractive. And then, one day it was like, we'll take them for a picnic. And so I took them outside, and these people would come and they would see them. And again, these notions would be broken down like, oh, it's a worthwhile animal we're saving. Just we can think outside the realm of the panda, of the cute and cuddly, if you will, and we can look at biodiversity and the idea of conservation in a myriad of angles rather than just the things we see plastered on posters and, children's literature. And so with that being said, I'm going to now close my presentation with, again, the very last paragraph that I wrote for this Creative Open. Our strengths lie in our idiosyncrasies, the characteristics that build our greater selves. I write because I not only have to for my own mental health, but because I'm adept at it. For me, it comes with great ease, canoodling with my inner dialogues that I then attempt to solidify with the suppression of a keystroke. But I'm not a chemist, engineer, nor ecologist. You are. You've been able to capitalize on your own personal strong suits and mitigate your lesser characteristics, becoming what you are today, a funnel of sorts, sharing and cultivating your ideas for the betterment of our shared biosphere. And it's gatherings like this that bring me hope. They provide a viewing glass into a sustainable future. But what may be even more profound than the latter is they provide the opportunity for collaboration. They allow us to intermingle with one another, dusting along our ideas as we carry out our empathetic dialogues. And there's nothing more analogous, more promising to the flora and fauna we coexist with than such melting pots. Again, thank you all so much for attending today, and thank you.
Thank you,